Was the ancient Greek Lamia a vampire? The ancient Greek words Lamia and Empousa, names for female monsters from Greek mythology, are often translated or referred to as vampire in modern texts. But were they really vampires? Vampires are undead corpses that rise from their graves and survive by drinking human blood. Depending on the version of vampire mythology you're reading, they may also have other powers like shape-shifting, especially into bats, and they usually turn some or all of their victims into vampires as well. But does the Lamia actually share any of those features? Did the ancient Lamia or the Empousa have enough in common with a vampire for them to deserve the word? Hi! I'm Juliet. I'm a history lecturer at a British university, and on this channel I cover myth, legend, folklore, ghost stories, and weird and wonderful history in general. So today we are going to have a deep dive into the ancient Greek Lamia to work out just how close or not they might have been to vampires. Scholars of Greek mythology have been weirdly dismissive of the Lamia over the years. She tends to get dismissed as a demon, a bogey monster, some folklore, something nurses tell children to scare them into behaving themselves. And it's not that any of those things aren't true exactly, just that that seems to have meant that she's relegated to kind of a footnote in a lot of works. Now, the Lamia was a daimon. Daimons are spirits that exist between the gods and mortals. The word is given to the Christian concept of a demon, but an ancient Greek daimon is not the same as a Christian demon, not in a pagan context. They can be bad or they can be good. So Plutarch refers to Brutus's evil daimon. They can be evil, but equally they can be good, helpful spirits, more similar to other Christian concepts of angels. So attaching the label demon to a Lamia isn't inaccurate. She is a daimon. She's definitely bad, definitely the wicked variety. So it's not an inaccurate label, but there's more to the Lamia than that. The word Lamia is actually ancient Greek for a particular type of shark, a fierce type of shark, according to Liddell and Scott, who wrote the ancient Greek lexicon. So she may originally have been some kind of sea monster. She's also not the object of religious cult, which is again probably why she gets dismissed as a bogey monster, a fairy tale. Also, a lot of these are the type of people who will dismiss fairy tales in general. I'm with J.R.R. Tolkien on the importance of fairy stories. She is also one of those monsters that kill children, which are often used in folklore around the world to kind of scare small children into behaving themselves. For example, in Scandinavian folklore, you have creatures like the nökk that will drown or kill children who fall into rivers. It's a way of keeping children away from rivers, things like that. Child-eating demons are known from other mythologies. From Mexico, the weeping woman La Llorona, I believe that's how you pronounce it, also attacks children and kills children. So the Lamia does fit a pattern of world folklore, although I should say that child-killing monsters are equally terrifying to parents as they are to children, and in some references to the Lamia, she eats newborn babies specifically, and fears about monsters killing newborn babies have much more to do with the parents' entirely justified and well-founded fears. Infant mortality rates were very high in pre-industrial societies. There is also, in many mythologies and folklore, a fear of some kind of monster or creature or being stealing or killing a small baby, because sadly so many small babies died. Think about changelings in European folklore and that kind of thing. She does also seem to belong to very much an oral tradition. Most of the texts that describe the Lamia in any kind of detail are fairly late. So the word is Greek, Lamia, obviously means a shark. The creature is a creature of Greek mythology, and then of course the Romans kind of adopted and adapted and reused and retold and reworked Greek mythology in many ways themselves, as well as having some of their own Roman mythology. And most of the texts that describe the Lamia with any level of detail do tend to be from the Roman period, mostly Greek authors writing in the Roman period. Some Latin authors as well. So that implies that traditions around the Lamia were indeed predominantly oral traditions, and again that has led scholars to kind of consider her folklore more than mythology, although myths are retold orally in the ancient world as well, and myths are transmitted in pretty much the same way, oral retellings, nurses telling them to children. They just appear in more texts as well. In an ancient Greek mindset, there really isn't a kind of difference between myth and folklore. They didn't differentiate, and one of the texts we're looking at in this video refers to the Lamia as a mythos. Gives us the English word myth, a story, a fable. That's where that word comes from. So for the ancients, they wouldn't really have thought of her as any different to any other creatures. It's modern scholars that have kind of separated them off. One of the oldest, kind of fuller and more detailed descriptions of the Lamia comes from Diodorus Siculus. He was writing in Greek in the Roman period, in the 1st century BCE, and he was writing a universal history. So ancient writers were not short on ambition, and it was meant to be a history of the entire world from the beginning up to his present day, and it included a description of the Lamia. Diodorus is describing an area of Cyrene in Libya, and he says, "At the base of this rock in Cyrene was a large cave, in which, according to myth, had been born Lamia, a queen of surpassing beauty. But on account of the savagery of her heart, they say that the time that has elapsed since has transformed her face to a bestial aspect. For when all the children born to her had died, weighed down in her misfortune and envying the happiness of all other women in their children, she ordered that the newborn babes be snatched from their mother's arms and straightway slain. Wherefore among us, even down to the present generation, the story of this woman remains among the children, and her name is most terrifying to them. But whenever she drank freely, she gave to all the opportunity to do what they pleased unobserved. Therefore, since she did not trouble herself about what was taking place at such times, the people of the land assumed that she could not see. And for that reason, some tell in the myth that she threw her eyes into a flask, metaphorically turning the carelessness that is most complete amid wine into the aforesaid measure, since it was a measure of wine that took away her sight. One might also present Euripides as a witness that she was born in Libya, for he says, 'Who does not know the name of Lamia, Libyan in race, a name of greatest reproach among mortals?' And we can already tell from this description that this is blending what's probably a few different oral traditions and variations among the oral tradition about the Lamia. We've got the fact that she snatches newborn babies. As I say, the fear of the kidnapping or death of a newborn baby is very much a parent's fear. Still the case today, and even more so in a pre-industrial society. On the other hand, Diodorus Siculus also mentions that she is most terrifying to children, and that stories of the Lamia are told to children. So it may be that there's other versions where it's older children that she catches and eats, and those are stories told to children to make them behave. There's a reference to drinking freely. One of the things that is often said about the Lamia is that she drinks blood, and that's why she's compared to a vampire. In this case, it's not entirely clear what she's drinking, and it seems to be more wine than blood. Diodorus is making some snarky points about being drunk and overindulging in wine and alcohol. So it sounds more like she's drinking wine. Wine drunk in the Roman Empire was often red wine, so you can see how stories about drinking wine and stories about drinking blood might end up getting conflated in some way. But it does seem to be wine here. He notes that she's Libyan, but he's making the argument for it, so that suggests that there are other stories that say she's from somewhere else, presumably, most likely somewhere in Greece, and we will see a story about a Lamia from Corinth shortly. And the other theme that crops up is that she was once beautiful but was then made ugly, or made not beautiful, and he calls her bestial as well, so there's a link with animals. She's got an animalistic aspect to her. And we'll see all of these themes repeated through different versions. So there's a lot of different aspects of the Lamia that are current in various oral traditions that Diodorus Siculus is bringing together. And it's obviously a very old story already by this point. And we know that anyway. There's references to the Lamia in the 5th century BCE Greek comic playwright Aristophanes. So we know stories of the Lamia have been around for centuries and centuries before Diodorus Siculus is writing. We just don't have lengthy descriptions of her from earlier texts. The Lamia is also related to another female monster from Greek myth, who's often kind of conflated with the Lamia. In some cases, they're implied to be the same creature, which is the Empousa. Liddell and Scott describe Empousa as a hobgoblin, assuming various shapes, said to be sent by Hecate. So Empousa is another female monster, and her big trick is changing shape. So she can change from a woman to a dog in one Aristophanes play, things like that. And she's either sent by Hecate or the daughter of Hecate. Hecate is the Greek goddess of witchcraft. So there's a link with magic and witchcraft there. Although Hecate is also the goddess of crossroads, she's associated with the underworld. She has a kind of broader range than just magic and witchcraft, but it does imply some kind of connection with magic and witchcraft there. Both of them are also associated with the word mormo, which means a she-monster, a bogey used by nurses to frighten children, or more generally a bugbear, and Liddell and Scott note it's also an exclamation to frighten children with. So word mormo is usually used to describe a lamia or an empousa or both, and as I say, sometimes lamia and empousa themselves are used interchangeably. All three of them are a bit mixed up together. It does feel like, looking at especially the older sources, that there is an empousa that is shape-changing and a lamia that is child-killing, but they do get mixed up together quite frequently, or the same creature or character might be referred to with both words, and either one or both might be referred to as a mormo. Some scholars, including Debbie Felton, have suggested that the Libyan myth retold by Dio Chrysostom in his 1st century AD CE text Orations is also a description of the lamia. So Dio Chrysostom does not use the word lamia in this description. Felton and others have suggested that it has so much in common with a lamia that it must be a description of a lamia even if he hasn't said so. I am not convinced. So I'll read out some of the description. You can make your own mind up. Dio says, "The face was that of a woman. The breast and bosom and the neck too were extremely beautiful." Okay, so far so lamia-like. "The rest of the body was hard and protected by scales, and all the lower part was snake, ending in the snake's baleful head. Now the story does not say that these animals were winged like the sphinxes, nor that they, like them, spoke or made any sound whatever except a hissing noise such as dragons make." Dragons, note, in the ancient world are basically a type of snake. Very, very large snakes. And sometimes the word dragon and snake might be used interchangeably. So that's why he's referring to dragons making a hissing noise, that Greek dragons are really conceived of as big snakes, serpents. Going back to the animals he's describing here, they were the swiftest of all land creatures, so that no one could ever escape them. Dio says that these animals used guile with man here meaning specifically male, not humans, giving them a glimpse of their bosom and breasts, and at the same time they infatuated their victims by fixing their eyes upon them, and filled them with a passionate desire for special relations. Then the men would approach them as they might women, while they on their part stood quite motionless, often dropping their eyes in the manner of a decorous woman. This is, in Roman society, a way of showing that you are a modest, respectable woman, is this kind of stance. You see it on statues quite a bit, of the woman will be just sort of head down like this. But as soon as a man came within reach, they seized him in their grasp, for they had claw-like hands too, which they had kept concealed at first. Then the serpent would promptly sting and kill him with his poison, and the dead body was devoured by the serpent and the rest of the beast together. So you can see the links with the idea of the lamia, and there is some suggestion that lamias are particularly well endowed in the chest area, and that would seem to fit that description. There's some similarities with the story of the lamia from Corinth that we're going to tell in a moment. But not only is this creature referred to as a snake, office, snake, it hisses, it's also like a dragon. Dragons can also be referred to as office. It is a snake-type creature. Dio Chrysostom also refers to this creature he's describing as therion. That is a wild animal. Therion is very much definitely an animal, whereas a lamia is usually a daimon, a spirit, an immortal spirit, a fantastical mythical creature, whereas what Dio is describing is a rather fantastical wild animal, more like a serpent or a dragon, or he mentioned a sphinx or a phoenix or the giant gold-digging ants Herodotus was convinced lived out in the Near East. Dio seems to be describing this creature as going with those, and there is a whole theme in Roman period literature about snakes in Libya. The poet Lucan, in his poem Civil War, which is a historical set poem about the civil war between Julius Caesar and Pompey, He has this whole section with these deadly snakes in Libya, which is described in great amounts of detail, and they kill this entire army of men. Libyan snakes have a reputation for being very, very dangerous and extreme and dramatic. So this seems to me to fit much more in the tradition of the dramatic, weird, dangerous Libyan snakes, not the female child-eating monster that is the Lamia. Yes, I'm sure snakes could kill children, but in this case they're going after young men, and honestly this just does not sound like a Lamia to me at all. There are lots of monstrous female creatures with serpent body parts in Greek mythology, so just because it's a female monstrous creature with a snake part doesn't make it a Lamia. It really doesn't seem to have any characteristics of a Lamia. There are some brief references in Latin literature to the Lamia. Horace Ars Poetica from the 1st century BCE makes a brief reference to the Lamia eating children, which really does seem to be her main thing. Apuleius' 2nd century CE novel Metamorphoses, sometimes known as the Golden Ass, also uses the word Lamia briefly. This comes in the middle of a story being told by a character about the murder of his friend in an inn. And the character has been weed on by the murderers, who are a couple of unpleasant old witches. And he says, but he, which is the murder victim, stunned by the vile stench of the liquid those Lamiae had drenched me with, shoved me off violently. What they've done is they've murdered his friend Socrates and replaced Socrates' heart with a sponge. Then he has magically come back to life, but as soon as he tries to cross a river, the sponge falls out and he dies. This story is fascinating for all sorts of reasons. But the main point here is that these two witches are referred to as Lamiae, plural of Lamia. This is a tricky one because honestly, that seems to me like it could just be a metaphor. Like, these are witches, which are a kind of monstrous woman. There's loads of witches in the Metamorphoses. The whole novel is about a guy who gets turned into a donkey because he starts messing around with witchcraft. So there's a lot of different witches. This is the only time the word Lamia is used. And it strikes me as just a writer using a metaphor. These Lamiae, like you might describe if you're writing a novel, a monstrous character as, oh, they were a serpent. You don't mean they're literally a snake. You mean they're snake-like in their characteristics. Or he's a wily fox. He's not literally a fox. So I'm a bit dubious about that one. But again, it does connect the Lamia with magic, in a way. The best known description of a Lamia, and the one that gives us this connection with seducing men that is part of the reason people think the Dio Chrysostom text is describing a Lamia, is from Philostratus's text, The Life of Apollonius of Tyana. So Apollonius of Tyana was a Neo-Pythagorean philosopher, visionary and miracle worker. He was arrested under first the Emperor Nero and then Domitian, both in the 1st century CE, on charges including strange clothing and lifestyle, people calling him a god, predicting a plague at Ephesus, and ritually murdering a child. Now, only one of those would strike most of us as something you should arrest somebody for, which is obviously the murder. The point about it being a ritual murder is that the Roman conception of magic often involved human sacrifice. Romans were against human sacrifice, or at least they said they were, and they thought of it as associated with kind of dark rituals and black magic. So the point of this charge is not just the murder, which obviously would be enough by itself, but the ritual murder in some kind of weird black magic. And if you're interested in Roman conceptions of magic, check out episode 2 of my History of Witchcraft and Magic in Europe, which focuses on the ancient Roman world. Apollonius successfully defended himself both times and died in the reign of Emperor Nerva, who he seemed to get on okay with. His life was written by Philostratus 2 centuries later, in the 3rd century AD, or CE. And one of the things Philostratus is doing in the life of Apollonius is defending him against the idea that he is a sorcerer or a magician. There are a lot of similarities between Apollonius and Jesus, and by this point Christianity is becoming more well known. People are noticing the similarities, and then Christians are saying, oh, but Apollonius is an evil sorcerer. So Philostratus is saying, no, he's not a sorcerer or a magician, he is a philosopher, and that's kind of the point of the text. Early on in the life of Apollonius, he and his friends encounter an Empousa, which keeps changing shape. and Apollonius curses it and it runs away. So he meets both an Empousa and a Lamia over the course of this biography. It's a little bit later that he meets the Lamia, and here is how Philostratus tells the story. It starts with a friend of Apollonius called Menippus. As Menippus was walking all alone along the road towards Cenchrea, he met with an apparition, and it was a woman who clasped his hand and declared that she had been long in love with him, and that she was a Phoenician woman and lived in a suburb of Corinth. And she said, "When you reach the place this evening, you will hear my voice as I sing to you, and you shall have wine such as you never before drank, and there will be no rival to disturb you, and we two beautiful beings will live together." The youth consented to this, for although he was in general a strenuous philosopher, he was nevertheless susceptible to the tender passion, and he visited her in the evening, and for the future constantly sought her company as his darling, for he did not yet realise that she was a mere apparition. Then Apollonius looked over Menippus as a sculptor might do, and he sketched an outline of the youth and examined him, and having observed his foibles, he said, "You are a fine youth, and are hunted by fine women, but in this case you are cherishing a serpent, office snake, and a serpent cherishes you." Menippus then gets engaged to this mysterious woman, and we are told, Apollonius waited for the occasion of the wedding breakfast, and then, presenting himself before the guests who had just arrived, he said, "This fine bride is one of the vampires." Now, vampire is the English translation that has been used by a few different translators. The Greek word is Empousa. This fine bride is one of the Empousas. Empousai. That is to say, of those beings whom the many regard as lamias, lamii, and hobgoblins, and the word for hobgoblins is mormolukeion. These beings fall in love, and they are devoted to the delights of Aphrodite, but especially to the flesh of human beings, and they decoy with such delights those whom they mean to devour in their feasts. And the lady said, "Cease your ill-omened talk and begone," and she pretended to be disgusted at what she heard, and in fact she was inclined to rail at philosophers and say that they always talked nonsense. When, however, the goblets of gold and the show of silver were proved as light as air and all fluttered away out of sight, this is all the stuff she's provided for the wedding feast, because Menippus doesn't have any money. She's provided all the things for the party, while the wine-bearers and the cooks and all the retinue of servants vanished before the rebukes of Apollonius. The phantom, and this is her, and the word here is phasma, which does reasonably straightforwardly translate to phantom. The phantom, pretended to weep, and prayed him not to torture her nor to compel her to confess what she really was. But Apollonius insisted and would not let her off, and then she admitted that she was an Empousa, and again translated quite often as vampire, but the word is Empousa, and was fattening up Menippus with pleasures before devouring his body, for it was her habit to feed upon young and beautiful bodies, because their blood is pure and strong. So right at the very end there, we have the only thing to really connect this to vampires, which is the idea that they're interested in their blood, although she's not just planning to drink his blood, she is going to eat him. She's fattening him up. So it doesn't sound like it's just the blood she's interested in. You can see here why scholars have identified the Dio Chrysostom story about the snake creatures in Libya as relating to a Lamia, not just because the Lamia is often said to be from Libya in various sources, but it seems to match this. This woman as described as a being that people call Empousa, Lamia, or hobgoblin. And Philostratus seems to put all of those three in one category. He suggests that they're all basically the same thing, that this creature is what people refer to by that name. If you take out the Dio Chrysostom text, she doesn't really have all that much in common with the Lamia. She's not eating children, she's eating grown men. Menippus is her husband, they've just got married. It's a sort of a Black Widow story. She's luring this handsome young man with an appearance of physical beauty, and she's going to literally devour him. The praying mantis story, I suppose. She's described as a phantom as well. Again, that links much more with later vampire tradition, where vampires are undead, but is different to the Lamia, who's a daimon usually, and different again to Dio Chrysostom's wild animal. Phasma, phantom, does suggest spirit of a dead person, although it could also be a daimon or a sort of a vague, nondescript creature. But this story is the one that's best known, and this is why the Lamia is so often associated with vampires, because there is a hint of being interested in drinking Menippus's blood. She does want to drink his blood, as well as eating him. She wants his flesh too, but she does also want to drink his blood. She does appear to be some kind of undead, judging by the reference to a phasma, and because she does what vampires in later Victorian tradition and onwards do, which is appear beautiful and seduce a beautiful young person. But I mentioned earlier that the word lamia in Greek means a shark, as well as this monster. And some later Roman period scholars writing commentaries on older texts suggested that lamia was the mother of Scylla. Scylla is one of the sea monsters from the Odyssey. Usually she has kind of half fish parts or half sea monster parts, or she's a bit like a hydra. She's got half woman and half monster, or half woman and half fish, depending on the version. But that continues that connection of the lamia with the sea that seems to have completely disappeared from Philostratus, or even from Dio Chrysostom. When she's associated with Libya, she's not then associated with the sea, given that Libya is well known for being largely desert. Diodorus Siculus' description about her being blind gets picked up by Plutarch. Plutarch is writing early 2nd century CE, maybe end of the 1st. He mentions the lamia in a text translated into Latin as de curiositate, on curiosity, but really more on busybodies. The Greek is polypragmosunes, on busybodies. He says, like the lamia in the mythos, sometimes translated as fable, who, they say, when at home sleeps in blindness with her eyes stored away in a jar, but when she goes abroad, puts in her eyes and can see. So each one of us in our dealings with others abroad puts his meddlesomeness like an eye into his maliciousness, but we are often tripped up by our own faults and vices by reason of our ignorance of them, since we provide ourselves with no sight or light by which to inspect them. So he's using the lamia as an example to make a point about meddling in other people's business. But he refers to that story Diodorus Siculus told that we haven't seen mentioned in the others, about the lamia storing her eyes in a jar. Pausanias' description of Greece has another version again. Pausanias' description of Greece is what it sounds like. He travelled around Greece describing it. He would have been a travel vlogger if he was alive now. And he often describes the folklore and the history of the places he's visiting. He doesn't just describe the landscape. And at one point he says, the former Sibyl I find was as ancient as any, but the Greeks say that she was a daughter of Zeus by Lamia, daughter of Poseidon, that she was the first woman to chant oracles, and the name Sibyl was given her by the Libyans. Another connection with Libya, but connecting the Lamia with the sea as the daughter of Poseidon, god of the sea. There is also a black figure vase from around 500 BCE, they're very hard to date, which a lot of scholars think is showing a lamia. Now, there isn't a helpful label on this vase. Some Greek vases will actually label the characters, especially if it's a character from mythology. So you'll get a warrior and he'll actually have a little label saying Achilles. So you know exactly who it is and who it's meant to be, and we love those artists. This one does not have a helpful label, so we don't know for sure that it is a lamia. It's usually assumed to be a lamia because of the large bosom. The figure also appears to be intersex, which may link to the Empousa's shape-changing abilities. Worldhistory.org suggests that Aristophanes, the 5th century playwright, describes the lamia as intersex. The Greek word would be hermaphrodite in ancient Greek. But none of the references collected at theo.com suggest that. If you know the reference where Aristophanes implies that the lamia is intersex or that the Empousa is intersex, give me a shout. Let me know in the comments, because I genuinely would love to know, but I have not come across an Aristophanes reference that implies that. Although the Empousa is shape-changing, and shape-changing in ancient mythology does often include switches between biological sex or gender or both. So it could be a lamia, it could be an Empousa. I don't think we can be sure that it is. The figure here is being tortured by satyrs and has been tied to a tree by the looks of things, which does suggest they are some kind of monster. And then as time went on over the centuries, in later periods, the lamia became associated partly with witches and partly with the idea of kind of vampires and the romanticised idea of vampires. In the late medieval and early modern period, demonologists started referring to witches as lamia, along with the Latin word strix. A strix is literally a screech owl, believed in Roman times to suck the blood of young children. So there's the blood sucking and the attacks on young children, both clearly connected with the lamia, and then both words come to mean witch in medieval contexts. Later on still, John Keats wrote a romantic poem called Lamia, inspired by the life of Apollonius of Tyana, Tyana, but he made Lamia a more tragic and romantic figure rather than a vampire-like villain. She was also depicted as a beautiful woman by several Victorian and early 20th century painters, including some of the pre-Raphaelites like John William Waterhouse here. So, is the Lamia a vampire? Should Lamia or Empousa be translated as vampire? In some versions, the Lamia does appear beautiful, but actually plans to kill and ensnare young men, primarily the life of Apollonius of Tyana, and if we count the Dio Chrysostom one, that one as well. Problem being, I don't think we should count the Dio Chrysostom one as an example of a Lamia. He doesn't use the word Lamia. It's not a Lamia. It's an animal, and it seems to me more like the life of Apollonius of Tyana has incorporated aspects of the stories about the snake-like animals into the Lamia, rather than the other way around. I mean, the Lamia is from Corinth rather than Libya in the life of Apollonius, which is obviously quite a significant difference. But I don't know, it's quite a late source, it's 3rd century CE, and it just seems like a real outlier to me. It feels like it's attached the word Lamia to kind of a bunch of other traditions. If we look at the other texts, if we take out those two, the main thing about the Lamia is she eats children, whether it's babies or whether it's slightly older children or both. She's a baby killer, she's a child killer, a child eater. And that's kind of her main thing, alongside other bits and pieces like keeping her eyes in a jar. The Empousa's main thing is that she's a shapeshifter. And that's kind of the difference between the two as well. And either one could be both. A Lamia could potentially be a shapeshifter, and Empousa might attack children, but that seems to be the broad kind of conception, is Lamia is baby killer, Empousa is shapeshifter. Both can be associated with witches, especially Empousa being the daughter of Hecate in some sources. Apuleius has the Lamiae collect blood, but again, they seem more like witches and he's just using it as a metaphor. Although, having said that, if he's using the word Lamia as a metaphor for a witch that collects blood, maybe that implies that the Lamia does drink blood and that there's a strong connection there. Then there's all those connections with the god Poseidon, with the sea monster Scylla, sharks, and the sea. That has nothing to do with vampires whatsoever. So it seems to me that the answer to is the Lamia a vampire is no. And the same for an Empousa. A Lamia eats children, is a baby-killing monster, has associations with the sea, may or may not keep her eyes in a jar, may be from Libya, may have an association with witchcraft. An Empousa is a shapeshifter, probably associated with witchcraft. Neither of them are undead. If we take out Philostratus calling the Lamia a phantom, they are daimones, or monsters, spirits. They're not undead people. They may drink blood, but they also eat flesh. Particularly the Lamia will eat flesh, so she's kind of drinking blood as part of the course, not only drinking blood. They also do not turn anyone else into a Lamia or an Empousa. That's another key part of vampire mythology and is completely missing. You don't get turned into a Lamia if you're caught by a Lamia, you just get eaten. Really, it seems to me that they really don't have very much in common at all, apart from maybe some blood drinking, maybe some shape-shifting, but those are pretty common attributes of mythological monsters, and it doesn't seem like anything like a strong enough connection to me to call a Lamia or an Empousa a vampire. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and until next time, bye!